Fascinating collection of stuff this time. YouTube transcripts, research articles, even some personal notes you guys sent in.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's all about trauma, how trauma affects us, maybe in ways we don't always realize.
And how it's not just like in our heads, right? It really gets into our bodies.
Yeah, exactly. Like it kind of rewires us.
Mm-hmm.
So today we're gonna dive deep into all of that. And I think a good place to start is with, the idea of trauma's impact, but like physically
Beyond just like shell shock.
beyond shell shock, exactly.
Yeah.
One of the YouTube transcripts you sent, there's this guy, Tom, Vietnam vet,
Right.
having these intense nightmares. And his story, it just shows how trauma, it's not just bad memories.
Oh, absolutely. Like Tom's story, it's almost like, what Abram Gardner, this psychiatrist, was
Yeah.
talking about way back in 1941.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he called it traumatic neurosis. And he was really onto something, this idea that trauma, like, messes with our bodies. He saw how people who were totally fine before, after trauma, they'd become, like, withdrawn, shut down,
Yeah. Yeah, in the transcript, you see that with Tom, right? Like, he can't even connect with his own family.
Right.
It's like he's numb.
That numbness, that's a classic symptom of trauma, right? It's almost like a defense mechanism
Yeah.
to protect yourself from those horrific experiences. But then it also blocks you from, really living, feeling joy.
It's like they're trapped behind this wall.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just them, right? Sarah Haley, she writes about this, about reporting atrocities. It's hard for everybody, survivors and, like, society,
Oh, for sure.
to actually face the horror of trauma.
Yeah.
We kind of avoid it collectively.
Well, yeah, I mean, trauma is overwhelming. It's
Yeah.
like it pushes us to the edge of what we can handle.
Yeah.
Sometimes the only way to cope is to shut down.
Shut down. Yeah.
Numb yourself to the pain, but like we're seeing, that comes with a price.
It really shows that trauma, it's bigger than just one person.
Oh, absolutely.
It affects everybody. Okay, so let's jump ahead a bit to the 1990s, when we start to actually see what's going on inside the brains of people who've experienced trauma.
Brain scans.
Brain scans,
Yeah.
PD scans, fMRI, we could actually see how trauma affects the brain.
Which is amazing, right?
Yeah. And it leads us to this idea that the body keeps the score.
Mhm.
Another YouTube transcript you sent, it talks about this study with this woman, Marcia. She was reliving the trauma of her daughter's death in a car accident, but she was inside an fMRI scanner,
Wow.
so they could see her brain activity during a flashback. Isn't that wild?
It really is.
And what they saw, it's just incredible. During those flashbacks, her Broca's area, the part of the brain that helps us with speech, it basically went offline.
Wow. So she's reliving it, but she can't even put it into words.
Exactly. Like the trauma was so powerful, it created this disconnect between her emotions, which were going crazy, and her ability to actually say what was happening.
Which is so important, right? Because that explains why some people have trouble talking about their trauma. It's not just that they don't want to. It's like their brain's not letting them.
It's like this roadblock in their brain.
Mm-hmm. And seeing it on brain scans, that proves it, right? Trauma, it's not just psychological, it's physical.
Totally. And get this, Marcia's brain scans actually show that trauma can leave these marks, like similar to what you see after a stroke.
Oh, wow.
It's like a scar on the brain.
Yeah.
So this brings us to our next point, being stuck in survival mode. And to understand this, we're actually going to look at animal studies.
Interesting.
I know, it seems strange, but they can teach us a lot about how trauma affects us, even as humans, I know animal studies can be controversial, but the ethics of that are a whole other deep dive.
Right, right.
One study you sent, it talks about Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness.
Oh, with the dogs.
Yeah. He was giving these dogs electric shocks, and they couldn't escape. It's rough, but stick with me.
Yeah.
What he found was, after a while, they just gave up. Even when he opened the cages, they wouldn't leave. They just whimpered.
Like they'd learned there was no point in trying.
Exactly. It's like the trauma taught them, hey, resistance is futile.
And it's so sad because it's like what happens to people who've been through trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
They feel trapped, even when there might be a way out. It's that fear response. It just takes over.
Yeah, so it's like trauma rewires how we see a danger. Even when we're safe, we feel threatened.
Exactly. You're always on edge, hypervigilant. You're overreacting to things. You can't tell what's actually dangerous and what's not.
It's exhausting.
It really is.
So what's becoming clear is that trauma, it's not just mental health. It affects our brains, our bodies, how we see the world, everything.
Like this ripple effect.
And as we keep going through these sources, we're going to see how these initial responses, they create these patterns that affect everything, our relationships, our emotions, even our physical health.
And whether we stay stuck in survival mode or whether we can actually heal.
Right. And that's a perfect segue to our next point, the power of connection, which is all about how human connection can help us heal from trauma. And this is where we start to talk about the vagus nerve.
The vagus nerve, yeah.
This thing fascinates me. It's connected to so much in our bodies.
It's a pretty amazing nerve, right? Like this long wandering nerve connecting our brain to like our heart, our lungs, our gut.
Gut too, wow.
Yeah, and it's a two-way street, right? Information going back and forth between the brain and the body. And it's super important for trauma because it helps us regulate our physical state, our heart rate, our breathing, even how we socialize.
So how does it tie into trauma specifically?
Okay, so Steve Porges, he's got this theory, the polyvagal theory. He says our nervous system, it's like on a spectrum. We shift between three states: social engagement, fight or flight, and freeze.
Right.
When we feel safe, our social engagement system is on, we're open to connecting with others, our heart rate's chill, our breathing's good, we can communicate and be social. But when we sense danger...
Fight or flight kicks in.
Exactly. Adrenaline pumping, heart racing, you're ready to fight or run away. Classic survival instinct.
We've all felt that, right?
Oh, yeah.
But what about when you can't fight and you can't run?
That's where freeze comes in.
Freeze, okay.
And the vagus nerve, it's got this part called the dorsal vagal complex. When we freeze, that part takes over. Your heart rate slows way down, your breathing gets shallow, your body's basically shutting down non-essential functions to conserve energy.
Like playing dead.
Exactly. It's a super old survival mechanism. But for people who've been through trauma, this freeze response can get triggered like all the time, even when they're safe.
Oh, wow.
Their nervous system gets out of whack, they have trouble shifting between these states, they're constantly on high alert, they jump at everything, and even small stressors can make them shut down completely.
It's like they're reliving the trauma over and over.
And that's why understanding this polyvagal theory is so important.
Yeah.
It shows us that trauma isn't just about the event itself, it's about how that event changes our nervous system.
So we have to go beyond just talking about it.
Right.
We have to work with the body, the nervous system, like the very foundation of who we are.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive: how to move beyond talk therapy and re-educate the body and mind to create a sense of safety and regulation. Welcome back to our deep dive into trauma. You know, before we jump into the next point, I think it's important to pause for a moment and think about what this all means for you, the listener.
Oh, totally. Like, how can we actually use this knowledge about trauma in our own lives?
Exactly. When we understand how trauma works, how it affects the body and the brain, we can start to recognize the signs, you know, maybe in ourselves, maybe in people we care about, like someone's overreacting or they seem really withdrawn. Maybe it's not just their personality, maybe it's their nervous system, you know, still dealing with past trauma.
Yeah, it's like having more compassion and understanding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It helps us be more patient with each other, with ourselves.
Because trauma, it's not a weakness, it's a natural response to something overwhelming.
Right?
It's like our bodies are trying to protect us.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that, I think it helps break down that stigma around trauma so people feel more comfortable seeking help.
Definitely. And speaking of help, that leads us to our next point: beyond talk therapy. We've got to go beyond just talking about trauma.
Right.
We need to address the body, the nervous system, the whole package. One of the YouTube transcripts you guys sent in, it really highlights this, the story of Sherry.
Oh, yeah.
She struggles with skin picking, and she can't really feel her body.
It's like the trauma got stuck
Yeah.
inside her body, and it's coming out in these physical ways.
It's like her body's trying to tell her something. It reminds me of Antonio Damasio's work. He's a neuroscientist.
Okay.
He says our emotions, they're not just in our minds, they're connected to what we feel in our body, like our physical sensations.
It's not just about changing our thoughts, it's about feeling our way through it.
That's a great way to put it. Trauma can mess with that connection to our bodies, make it hard to even identify what we're feeling.
Yeah.
And that leads to this feeling of being disconnected, like you're not really present in your own life.
Which brings us back to that idea of agency, right? Trauma takes away that feeling of control.
Exactly. When your body's always screaming danger, even when you're safe, it's hard to feel like you have any power over your own life.
Yeah, you're just reacting all the time.
You're stuck in that survival mode, constantly waiting for the next bad thing to happen.
Exhausting. Okay, so this leads us to our next point: redrawing the map from childhood trauma to resilience. Let's talk about childhood trauma specifically.
Right, because when trauma happens in childhood, it hits during this crucial time when the brain is still developing.
Yeah, those early experiences, they shape how we see the world, how we see ourselves, everything.
It's like the trauma becomes part of the blueprint of our brains. And we see this in Marilyn's story from one of the YouTube transcripts.
Well, Marilyn with the family portrait.
Yes. She describes this portrait. She's a kid in the picture, and she looks so scared, trapped.
You could just feel it, the impact of those early experiences.
It's heartbreaking. And it shows how important attachment is.
Attachment.
Yeah, like when kids feel safe and secure, they learn to trust the world, they know their needs will be met.
Right.
But when that attachment is messed up, like in cases of childhood trauma, it can create all these problems later on with relationships, with managing emotions, with self-esteem.
It's like they never learn how to trust.
Mm.
And then there's the ACE study. Remember that one? The Adverse Childhood Experiences study.
Oh, yeah, that study was a game changer.
It showed just how common childhood trauma really is and how it affects our health, both mental and physical, even years later.
The more ACEs a person has, the more likely they are to have all these health problems, like heart disease, cancer, you name it.
It's scary, really.
It is. Trauma, it's a public health crisis, not just a personal problem.
So we need to be doing more to prevent it, to support families?
Absolutely, and that's a perfect segue to our 7th point, moving beyond diagnosis, towards a new understanding of trauma. A lot of the sources you guys sent talked about how the DSM, the book they use to diagnose mental health conditions, it doesn't always capture the full picture of trauma.
Yeah, like it's too focused on symptoms and not on the whole person.
Exactly. And there's this debate about developmental trauma disorder or DTD, whether it should be in the DSM.
Right.
And that debate shows that we need to move beyond just checking off boxes on a list.
Yeah.
We need a more holistic view of trauma, how it affects development, relationships, self-regulation, everything.
It's like the DSM is trying to understand a rainforest by looking at a single leaf.
That's a great analogy.
You're missing the whole ecosystem.
Exactly. To really get trauma, we have to look beyond individual symptoms. We have to consider the whole person, their relationships, their history, their culture, everything that shapes their experience.
So it's not about labeling people, it's about understanding them.
That's the key. And when we shift from diagnosis to understanding, that's when real healing can begin.
That's a beautiful thought.
It is, right? It means that even though trauma can leave deep wounds, it doesn't have to define us. We can heal, we can grow, we can change.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into trauma. So we've talked about the impact, especially on the body, and how childhood trauma is, well, it's a whole other layer of complexity, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But now let's talk about healing. Like, what does it actually mean to heal from trauma?
You know, one thing that really struck me from all the stuff you sent in is that healing, it doesn't mean forgetting the trauma.
Right.
It's not about erasing it. It's more about like integrating it into your life in a way that you can feel whole again.
Okay, yeah.
Safe, connected, all of that.
Yeah, and a lot of the sources talked about this idea of re-educating the body and the mind. It's not just about changing your thoughts. It's about changing how you feel in your body, your actual experience of being in the world.
Exactly. And we saw how traditional talk therapy, sometimes it's just not enough, especially when the trauma is really stuck in the body.
Yeah, like Sherry's story.
Sherry? Yeah.
Remember, she was struggling with skin picking and that lack of sensation.
Right. It was like her body was trying to communicate something, trying to break free from that numbness.
Wow, yeah.
And that's where these mind-body therapies can be really helpful.
Mind-body therapy is so
Yeah, they bridge that gap between the mind and the body so you can start to reconnect with your sensations, your emotions, but in a safe way.
So, like, what kind of therapies are we talking about?
Well, one that was mentioned a lot is somatic experiencing.
Somatic experiencing. Okay, I've heard of that, but
It's all about working with those trapped sensations in the body, gently and gradually.
so instead of just talking about the trauma, you're actually feeling it in your body.
In a way, yes, but it's very controlled, very safe. It's like, imagine you have a really tangled knot,
Okay,
and you're slowly, carefully untangling it strand by strand.
got it, yeah.
That's kind of what somatic experiencing is like. You're releasing the grip of that past trauma.
Fascinating.
Another one that came up was EMDR.
EMDR. That's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, right?
That's the one. It uses these bilateral stimulations, like eye movements or tapping,
Okay.
to help process traumatic memories.
How does that work?
Well, the idea is that trauma can disrupt the way our brains process information. So those memories, they get stuck.
Like a broken record?
Kind of, yeah. They're fragmented, they feel super intense, and they keep popping up at random times. EMDR helps reprocess those memories so they're not as disturbing.
So it's not about forgetting them, it's about changing how they feel.
Exactly. You're integrating them into your life in a healthier way.
I love that.
And what's so cool about these therapies is that they're not just about talking.
Yeah,
They're about working with the body, with the nervous system, recognizing that trauma lives there too.
totally. And it's not just therapy, right? A lot of the sources talked about the importance of human connection.
Oh, absolutely. Feeling safe and connected, that's crucial for healing.
And this is where the polyvagal theory comes in again, right?
Mhm.
Like, when we feel safe with other people, it helps calm down our nervous system,
It activates that social engagement system.
right? And it helps us move out of that survival mode.
Exactly. Having those attuned relationships where you feel seen, heard, understood, that can be incredibly healing.
Yeah, it's like building new pathways in the brain, pathways of safety and connection.
Beautifully put.
So even though trauma can be so damaging, we're not powerless.
No, not at all.
We can heal, we can build resilience.
And there are so many ways to do that. The sources you sent mention things like yoga, meditation, mindfulness.
Oh yeah, those are great tools.
They help you become more aware of what's going on inside, your thoughts, feelings, sensations, and then you can start to regulate them better.
It's like you're building your own inner toolkit for dealing with stress and difficult emotions.
Exactly. So the takeaway here is that even though trauma can leave a deep imprint, you have the power to heal.
That's a powerful message.
The brain and body are amazingly adaptable.
Mm-hmm.
With the right support, and by tapping into your own strength, you can find your way back to wholeness.
That's beautiful.
It is, isn't it?
Wow. This has been such an incredible journey. We've covered so much, from the depths of trauma to the incredible potential for healing.
It really has been a deep dive.
Before we go, any final words of wisdom for our listeners?
Just this. If you've been affected by trauma, please know that you are not alone.
Yeah.
There's hope and there's help. Healing, it's not a straight line, it's a journey. Be kind to yourself and remember that you are stronger than you think.
That's so important.
It really is.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of trauma. We hope you learned something and that it gives you hope and maybe even inspires you to continue exploring this on your own. Remember, even in the darkest of times, there's always that spark of resilience inside each and every one of us.